Everyone, today I'll be going over Java Lesson 4, which is on methods, classes, and objects. So we'll be going over methods, the structure of Java, classes, and objects. So methods are a block of code that runs only when it's called. And methods are basically, another word for them is like a function. And so each method performs a certain action. And it's useful for sectioning and organizing your code. And it also makes it really easy to use a block of code over and over again without having to put it inside a for loop. So based on the structure of Java, you should have a bunch of methods that each do small, tiny things. And the syntax for this is public, void, and then you can give your method any name you want. And then you've got your parentheses, and then you've got brackets. And inside those brackets is the piece of code you want to execute. So why don't we make a method? So to create the method, we want this to be outside this main function. And we'll talk more about that why later. And then the way we're gonna do is we're gonna go public void, and my method name is gonna be print name because that's what I want to do. And then we've got brackets. And so if you notice, this looks a lot like this, right? With just a few minor changes. It's got the word static, and it's also got these things inside the parentheses. So this is also a method. These are two methods, and you usually do not want to have, you never want to declare a method inside of another one. You could definitely call the method inside of another one, but you definitely don't want to declare it. So we're declaring a method right now here. And so in this method, I'm going to make a variable called my name. I'm going to call it string name. And then I'm going to print it out. Great, so we have our method. So you see that there's this word public here and this word void, right? So what are those for? So public specifies how and who can access this method. So public means it's available to everybody, and then void is used to specify the return type. And we'll talk more about this later. So now let's move on to this method right here. We've already established that this is a method, right? And this is usually where we had put all of our code in before. So why is that? Well, this main method is where basically all of your code will be executed. And you must call each of your methods here in order for them to execute it. So right now, if we run this, nothing would happen because we only defined this function. But in order for this to actually run, we have to call it. And we do that inside the main method. And so you can also, since this is a method, you can also code directly into this main function as we've done before. But you can also call other functions inside this main one. And then, of course, the syntax is we've got public, static, void, and then the name, which is main. And then you've got this thing right here. So static is basically telling that this method can be accessed without creating an object. And this will make more sense later. And then main is the name of the method. And then this string args is a parameter, and we'll talk more about this in another lesson. So let's move on to how to call the method. So the syntax would be just method name and parentheses and then a semicolon. So for here, calling the method would just be like this, just the method name, the parentheses and semicolon. However, this wouldn't work. If we run this, nothing would happen. Because in order to execute these methods, you would have to create an object. And this will make more sense a bit later. But this is how you would call this method, if you want to call it, inside any other method. Like, you want to make a new method called execute. That's how you would do it. And then you can just call the execute function method in here when you create the object. So that's how you would do that. So let's move on to the structure of Java. So there are two types of structures in general: procedural programming language and then object-oriented programming language. So Java is an object-oriented programming language, which means that it creates objects that contain data and methods, while procedural programming language writes procedures or methods that perform operations on data. So object-oriented programming languages are definitely more common, and they're definitely faster than procedural programming languages. So object-oriented programming languages have classes and objects, and this is basically a main part of it. So class defines a category, like it defines sort of the template, and then objects are instances of that category. For example, a class might be fruit, and so objects might be different kinds of fruits, like bananas, apples, and pears. Or a class might be like different types of transportation, and objects might be like boats, cars, airplanes, walking, things like that. And so all of your code would be inside these classes. All of your methods, the main method, and even the objects would be inside your class. So to create a class, what you have to do is you have to use the syntax, which is public class, and then any name that you want. And of course, curly brackets. So REPL-IT automatically defines a class when you create a file. So for example, here, the class is already defined here, right? And the class is called main. And so you can also notice that this main is also the name of the file here, main.java, right? So in order to modify this, you would have to, if you want this class to be, for example, want it to be name, then you would also have to modify it up here. And you can say, this is really important. If you don't do this, then it will get an error. So you can actually create a class when you automatically create the REPL. But let's say I have another file here, and I'm gonna call this you see here it's blank, right? So whenever you create new Java files inside your repository, you're going to have to create the class from scratch. And the class must be the name of the file as well. And you're also going to have to define your main function. So that would be public static void main. And even though not all classes have a main function, it's important if you actually want to execute anything in your code. So also take note that each file can only have one class. You can't have multiple classes in one file, but you can have multiple classes in one repository. So let's move on to class attributes. So class attributes are basically variables that are defined for that class, and they're also basically attributes that each object of that class should have. So going with our previous example, with the class of fruits, attributes might be the color, the fruit and the size of the fruit, and each object should have these attributes as well. For example, apple's color is red, right? And it's like medium sized, and then banana's color is yellow, and it's a large size. And same thing with transportation methods. Some attributes might be speed and size, and for an airplane it's pretty fast and it's pretty large, and a car it's got a slower speed and it's smaller as well. So these are basically attributes that you want to define in your class. So to create an attribute, it's basically you just want to define variables inside a class, but outside a method. So for example, here, I'm actually gonna rename this one as fruit to so fruit.java. And so this is a method, right? So we want to name our variables, name our attributes outside the method. So I might say string color. So we just defined an attribute. But what if I just want to define an attribute, but I don't actually want to assign a value to it? So that's simple. You just, the syntax is just the data type and the variable name. So I could do, string size, and that's all I have to do. And you can also access these values in all of your methods inside your class, and you can change and modify them. So for example, what I could do is I could take our variable color, and in here I can say color equals blue now. So I can also modify these inside methods. For example, I can make a new method. I'm going to call it set color. And then color equals blue. Just set the color. And I'll just print it out. So remember how previously we talked about static, right? So static is basically if I want to access these attributes or these methods without making a object. So like if you see here public, since it's got the keyword static in it, previously we were able to use this method just fine without ever having to create an object. So if I want to access set color method without creating an object, I can just write static void. And you always want to define it here, right between the return type void and public. And since I am using this attribute here, in order for this to work, I would also have to define this to be static as well. So to do that, you want the static to be outside, should be right before your variable string. So it looks like for classes in Replit, you always have to have the file named main, like the class named main. So this isn't true for any other platforms that you might use for coding Java, but this is true for Replit. So change this back to main. And let's run this now. Yeah, so it prints it out. Let's see if it prints out the method as well. Yeah, so it prints it out. So static is just when you want to run or run some code or use some attributes without creating an object. So let's talk about objects. Remember, to use the methods in the class itself, you have to create an object of the class if you don't want to make them all static. So this object can have any name and be anything, right? Because it's just an instance of that class. So the syntax for creating an object is you write the name of the class, you write then the name of the object you want, and then you set it equal to new, and then the name of the class again, and then parentheses and a semicolon. And this must be created inside the main function. So if I go here, the way I would do that is I would write main, I want to call this. So I would do main, and I'm going to call this instance 1. Set it equal to new main. So let's say I want to execute this method now, right? And we've created our object. So to execute this method, you must call it on the object. And so the syntax for that is you just do the name of the object, and then you do dot the name of the method, parentheses, and then semicolon. So for example, here I would do instance 1 dot set color. And let's run this. Yeah, so prints it out. So let's move on to attributes again. Let's go back to attributes. So remember we defined attributes to be, for example, for fruits might be size and color, right? So each object might have different values for these attributes. For example, apples and bananas are both objects of the fruit class, but they have different values for the attribute color, right? Apple's color is red, banana's color is yellow. So we want to be able to assign attributes to these objects themselves, right? We want to be able to say that apple's color is red and banana's color is yellow. So the syntax for that is you just do object name dot attribute name, and then you set it equal to a value. And you don't necessarily have to set it equal to a value, you can just define it. And this must be done inside the main function as well after you've defined the object. So here I might say dot color equals, let's do green. And I'm going to delete this here because we want the color to remain green. And let's see what it prints out. Yeah, right. So what we did here is that we set the color that's defined here equal to green. And so when this method ran, it took the color that was set to green and it just printed it out. And you might be wondering that, hey, we defined it here and we defined it here as well. So what would happen? So which one would the computer run? Would it run red or would it run green? So this, when you define it here, this overrides this part of the function. This overrides, this basically updates color, right? And this is the most recent thing that happened. So it would change the color to green and it will print out green. So that's how you would assign attributes. So that's basically it for today. We talked about what methods are, structure of Java, classes, objects, and attributes as well. So let's move on to the assignment. So for this assignment, you'll just be creating attributes, methods, and objects, and you'll be calling those methods and attributes onto those objects. So the link for this assignment is right here, and this assignment is a bit abstract. I didn't really give much directions or examples. So you just have to create 2 attributes. You have to create at least 3 methods that uses or modifies these attributes. You have to make 2 objects. You have to assign attributes to those objects. And you have to call methods on those objects. So for that reason, I've also given you an example where that we made in the session that has a class, has some attributes, has a method, and has called those attributes and methods. So that's for you to refer to. So you can find that right here. And that's all I have for you today, and thanks for watching.